You're listening to a bonus episode of The Dairy Age, featuring Teagasc's weekly Let's Talk Dairy webinar series, which is also available as a podcast.
Good morning, everyone. You are all very welcome to this week's Let's Talk Dairy webinar. We have Tomas Tubritt on with us. A lot of Tomas's work over the last number of years has been maybe around the Pasture Profit Index and a lot of the trial work and commercial farm work that feeds into that, Tomas, in terms of grass varieties. But I know myself, in terms of a lot of the questions, is you get handed a label or you get told here's special mix A and special mix B, and I don't know what sort of names is on them, but should we be using, I suppose, the Pasture Profit Index? And first of all, maybe what is it for farmers that maybe haven't come across it, Tomas?
Yeah, so morning, James, and everyone else. So the Pasture Profit Index is essentially, it's a variety selection support tool. So when you're reseeding, you look up the PPI list and it just gives you direction of what's being in a mixture. If you're looking at a mixture, what's actually in the mix and how those varieties perform, and what are the strengths and weaknesses of those varieties. So when you look at the PPI, it's essentially a table, like a league table, and it's ranking kind of 30 varieties from best to worst based on their overall merit. And how we determine its overall merit is taken from data collected by the Department of Agriculture's recommended list trial, and then there's also some data from Teagasc Moorepark wheat variety trials here, and that feeds some data into the PPI. And we take this data, we change this data into economic values, and the economic value expresses, the expected net profit per hectare per year that would be expected to be made on your farm by selecting that variety or a mixture of those varieties. That's essentially it. What's important to know about the PPI is, like I said, it's 30 varieties every year on the list, but there's also far more varieties are tested by the department and by us that will never make it onto the list because they're not good enough, essentially. So the PPI and the recommended list trials, they kind of act as a screening process whereby only the best varieties are making it onto Irish farms.
So ultimately, it's no different than EBI in terms of breeding and genetics. It's a ranking for grass seed varieties, and it's based around economics and what they're delivering actually on the ground as such. So I was only looking at it there this morning before we come on. There's loads of different things in it, Tomas, and I suppose if for people that's looking at it the first time, how do they go about using that? There's a number of different sub-indexes, there's heading dates, there's utilization figures, there's lots of different things. I suppose if I'm a dairy farmer and I'm looking at that and I'm saying, right, I want to do a bit of reseeding, how would I go about selecting the varieties I want to use?
Yeah, so like I said, the varieties are ranked based on their overall total PPI. So that's just kind of one figure, like totally EBI, just describes how overall how good that grass variety is. But within the PPI as well, there are a number of sub-indices or traits essentially associated with these varieties, and these traits are spring, summer and autumn herbage yield, you have herbage quality, you have silage yield for each variety, and we also have persistency of each variety. And each variety is given a score within each of those traits or sub-indices, and then if you add up the performance of a variety within each of those sub-indices, it gives you the total PPI of that variety. So that's essentially that's the overall merit, but we also have variety-specific performance of those varieties as well. Also within the PPI, we have the grazing utilization sub-index. So you'll see that on the right-hand side of the PPI. It's essentially a star rating, with the higher the stars, the better grazing utilization. And that's kind of an indication of how suited a variety is to intensive rotational grazing. Generally, varieties that are higher in the stars, the cows tend to get better cleanouts on them, and you're finding that you don't have to top them as much or do kind of corrections on those fields as much during the year. So then Oh, sorry, James.
Sorry, just on that in terms of, because I know there's been a bit of interest that has been added in the last couple of seasons, that has been an extra element that has been added.
Mm-hmm.
tell me, in layman's terms, a 1-star variety on utilization versus a 5-star variety. What are we talking in terms of the difference in terms of residuals at farm level as such, Tomas?
In terms of residuals, so how the index is derived is from variety plot trials that I'm running here in Teagasc Moorepark. And generally what I was finding is, so the varieties are in the field, cows go into the field, they graze it over a couple of hours, and when I go to the field, maybe the cows have gone for milking and I'm just inspecting how well the variety or the cows have done on those varieties. Our best varieties, our 5 stars, are readily grazed to 3.5, 4 centimeters, not a bother, whereas our 5-star varieties are closer to 5.5 and 6.
Okay, your poor or your 1-star varieties.
So it is kind of preference, and maybe if you had the cows in a field of a certain variety, they'd do better. But where they're given the choice of what they want to graze, they're actively showing that they like grazing their 5-star varieties. The 1-star varieties just don't, they don't like grazing them. And then where we find on farm where we have monoculture sown, the same varieties are always coming up, and it correlates very closely to what we're finding in plots. How come when I put the cows into this field, they didn't graze it out? That's essentially it,
Yep, absolutely. Another one maybe for you there is, I suppose, dairy systems of, they've got very much specialized in terms of, and differ in terms of, I suppose, milking platform stocking rates. But there's outside blocks there as well, and they're kind of being managed differently, I suppose. A grazing mix versus a silage mix, should we be using different varieties? And I suppose firstly on the grazing mix, what are we selecting for? How many varieties maybe should we be including, and should we be balancing for certain things, Tomas?
Yeah, so exactly, James. And that's what I suppose the sub-indices within the PPI allow us to make these more tailored mixtures. So we kind of have our grazing mixes, then our silage mixes, and then maybe a general purpose. So when we're looking at a grazing platform, the objective from those swards is to maximize the milk production from the cows grazing those swards, and to obviously ease grazing management and get as much grazings as possible off those paddocks. So what we're looking at there is essentially selecting varieties that are performing highly in the quality sub-index. So quality is essentially digestibility of the sward. Higher the digestibility, the more milk that we're going to get from the cows grazing that grass. And then secondly, you want to be looking at the grazing utilization sub-index. We want to utilize as much grass as possible into the diet of these cows, and we don't want to be getting up in the tractor topping or putting the cows back in there after milking for a couple of hours only to move them on later on in the night. Just creates a small bit of headaches. So they're the two main traits. And then once you kind of have those varieties maybe maximized in the grassland mix that you're looking at, have a quick look at the yield. You don't want, you don't want anything too low, particularly in spring and autumn yield, but generally most of the varieties, as you mix them together, you'll get overall kind of yield performance, and it should be fine. When we're looking then at our outblocks, they're probably going to be cut for maybe first or second cut silage. The main sub-index that we have to look at is the silage sub-index. So how the silage sub-index is derived is varieties are sown, then they're given a kind of a spring cut, as you would a spring grazing. They're closed for 6 or 7 weeks, cut for first cut silage, closed for another 5 or 6 weeks, cut for second cut. So it really is showing, it is reflective of what these varieties can do in the silage system, and we just want varieties that are performing highly in that sub-index as well. Sometimes you might have heifers grazing an outblock too. It's very easy to mix, say, good grazing utilizations where you want to get them cleaned out and silage. There are certain varieties there that perform well in silage and well in grazing utilization. So there is, scope to do that as well.
Yeah. And another one the farmers often ask, maybe with regards to those silage mixes, is heading date. Any recommendations on that in terms of, should we be trying to, if we've 3 varieties, to get them, I suppose, as close together as possible, and should we be looking at those later heading varieties, or what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so generally when we're talking about mixing varieties and heading dates, what we're normally saying, you wouldn't want to mix more than maybe 4 varieties together as kind of a max. And when it comes to silage swards, heading date seems to be really important. So you want to narrow that window of heading. Generally, if you're picking intermediates or lates, so long as the window is tight between 4 and 6 days, and you're aware of that. So, you could pick an intermediate heading mix for silage, but you'd want to be, getting into it about the 20th, 22nd of May. And I suppose maybe if you're picking later heading varieties that are high in the silage sub-index, you have a bit more days to play with, but still you have to be getting into them, before June essentially as well. What was your other question, James?
No, it was just in terms of should
we
around the date.
Yeah, and sorry, with heading date, then what I found now when we're looking at heading date in grazing swards is that it's not having as much as an effect as maybe it used to be thought, and there's probably two things happening. So heading date range between varieties on the list is probably narrowing. Beforehand, we would have had varieties heading in the 15th of May and much later, whereas that window already within the list seems to be narrowing. And also what we're finding is in a grazing scenario, if we're doing good grassland management, we're grazing at 1400 covers, the grasses ain't actually getting a opportunity to express their heading as such. And therefore, heading date doesn't really seem to have as much of an influence. So we've done trials where we've had mixtures of varieties with wide-ranging heading dates, and there was no real disadvantage in terms of quality, dry matter yield, any of those.
In grazing mixes.
In a grazing mix, yeah.
The other one, the age-old one that comes up, and it's detailed there on the PPI too, is diploid versus tetraploid, and I think there's been a fair shift on the ground in terms of towards tetraploids. Your thoughts on that and inclusions of both in mixes, maybe, Tomas?
Yeah. So tetraploids and diploids. So generally, what it means is it's just kind of difference in the cell structure of the varieties, and that means it's going to bestow kind of advantages and disadvantages in terms of the traits within the PPI essentially. So our diploid varieties, they tend to so we could have two swards both at 1400 kilograms of dry matter, but visually our diploid sward is going to be lower in height, and it's also going to be much denser, because obviously if it has the same amount of yield, that has to be come from somewhere. So that's the density that's going to give it that. So then our tetraploids tend to be more open and taller when we look at them. Also, our tetraploid varieties will tend to be lower in dry matter by about a percentage. Now, really, that's not going to make much of a difference when you're doing your grass walk or anything like that, but it's something to be aware of. But also within that, they tend to be higher in quality as well. So you're looking at maybe an extra percentage and a half in terms of digestibility for those varieties as well. And then lastly, looking at those, and it probably is a relationship between the higher quality and also the morphology of the sward, the more openness of those swards, our tetraploid varieties are shown to be far more utilizable on farms. So, cows just tend to far more ease in grazing them to your target post-grazing sward heights. And from the on-farm trial that we have, we've 100 farmers involved in the trial with, 5-6 paddocks dedicated to one variety. They're kind of balanced between ploidy, diploids and tetraploids. Always we kind of get asked for, the tetraploids stand out. The farmers like the tetraploids, or maybe the diploids stand out for the wrong reasons is how you could describe it. So really, tetraploids in a grazing scenario in particular really have more advantages than the diploids, and therefore we should be targeting to increase the amount of tetraploids in our swards. Generally, what we'd be recommending is, like me, based on this on-farm trial that we've seen, 100% tetraploid is no problem really. There might be concerns about their openness or their persistency, but we see no differences between those varieties. So generally, if you like not a challenge, but you're not so worried about maybe openness and stuff like that, 100% tetraploid is not a bother. Maybe if you're on wetter land and you've always kind of been a fan of diploids in your sward, maybe go to about 40% max. I think diploids in the sward is really as far as you can push it.
On the heavy soils program there, where a lot of the time it might have been 50-50 switch. A lot of those guys now on that demonstration farm program, they're at, as you say, they've diploids down to 30-40% of mixes now, and find much easier in terms of grazing management. In terms of, as always, folks, post your questions. If you have any questions for Tomas, we'll take them. I see one's in there. It's about a particular variety. We'll come to that in a moment. Persistency. There's one, I suppose. Are you seeing differences in terms of persistency, and what sort of weighting is on that within PPI?
Yeah, so persistency is a very important trait for varieties. When we're reseeding, it's going to cost us probably up to, with the way prices have gone, it's going to cost you €1,000 a hectare just to reseed, and therefore if you have to reseed more often, the fixed cost of that reseeding is increased. So for that reason, that has a massive weighting within the PPI. But what we're finding within our variety trials and on farm is that there's no difference really between these varieties in terms of their persistency, provided they're well managed. There's a caveat there. And really interesting work from Kieran Hearn here in Teagasc Moorepark. He looked at like the 8-year data set from our on-farm variety trial. So he balanced all the varieties and he looked at how their dry matter yield changes over time, essentially. So you can imagine year 0 to year 8, what we thought would happen would be there kind of be a linear decline. You might be losing 500 kilograms of dry matter every year, and then over time, a threshold is reached where you make a reseeding decision. But really interesting, Kieran has basically found that from year 1 to year 2, we do get quite a drop in dry matter yield, maybe up to 500 or a ton of dry matter. But that's probably more explained by when we reseed, there's going to be a kind of flush of nitrogen that's available for the following year, and that's giving us a kind of higher yield in the first year of that variety, and then we see that drop in year 2. But from years 2 to 4 to 6 to 8, we're really seeing no difference in the dry matter yield of these varieties. And even over time, from years 2 to 4, they seem to be quite stable. And from years 4 to 8, we're actually seeing a slight increase in the dry matter yield of those varieties. So anyone who's at the open day or has an open day booklet, you'll see a paper there, and there's a really nice looking graph where you really do see a stabilization of the varieties in terms of dry matter yield, which kind of telling us that these varieties are persistent over time. And one of the things from the on-farm trial we would see is where varieties maybe have been reseeded after 4 or 5 years, we get feedback from the farmers, why did they do that? And it was nothing to do with dry matter yield or quality or some other thing. It was more that they either did poaching, which does happen, and they decided they'd reseed it, or management difficulties. The cows did not like grazing their variety, and they said, feck it, I'll just reseed it and make my life easier. So rather than the varieties not persisting, it was something else wrong with the variety.
So really what you're telling us is, under correct management, I suppose good soil fertility always will come in there, Tomas, in terms of making sure our perennial ryegrasses persist, but under correct management, persistency isn't an issue in any of the varieties that's up there on the PPI.
Exactly.
A number of good questions coming in there, a couple of great ones actually in terms of clover, and I'll come back to that. I'm going to ask you the question when the PPI for clover is going to be ready. We put a wee bit of pressure on you or something like that into pipeline for clover. But suitabilities, varieties that is there any work ongoing there where there's varieties that you're seeing are better in terms of incorporating clover? And I suppose there's another question there similar in terms of tetraploids versus diploids. So any advice in terms of that whole clover piece and varieties that are showing you that it's easier to incorporate clover, Tomas?
Yeah, so I suppose we have a couple of things ongoing. So Clonakilty is known as a clover farm, but when Clonakilty started, there was also a perennial ryegrass variety component to that as well. So they had monocultures of perennial ryegrass sown with and without clover. And Anya Murray did a nice piece of work where she examined, were the varieties influencing how well the clover was doing. I suppose really nice piece of work, but the data coming from it was a bit mixed. So like the best variety that we had was, I think it was Glenveigh, which is a diploid that's gone off the list now. And Glenveigh was always known for being quite dense, but maybe not as vigorous in terms of growth. Whereas then the next varieties that follow were, I think, the 4 tetraploid varieties that were included in that trial. And then lastly, there was another 3 diploid varieties. So it was quite mixed, and we couldn't really make any concrete
conclusions as such.
Conclusions on that. And I suppose part of the problem there is, look, it's only 8 varieties. You probably do need a wider spread of varieties. So last year I sowed a small plot study of only about 10 varieties, and going forward we're going to be looking at do these varieties, I suppose they're more newer varieties that are currently on the list, so do these varieties influence how well the clover is doing? And we're also going to be actually looking at the traits of the perennial ryegrass and what's happening there, because it's grand to say that such a variety is good for clover and not so good for clover, but you also need the reasons behind that. So it's balanced for ploidy and stuff like that. So really the answer is no, we don't. And there could be a load of things going on. So the differences between tetraploids and diploids, yes, the diploids are denser, so you'd imagine there's less light and space for the clover to perform in. But if we have a really aggressive tetraploid variety that, you know, gets up and going very fast and shades out the clover very fastly, well, obviously that's not going to be very good for the clover either. So the work is ongoing. I suppose based on the plot work and stuff we have going in the future, I would hope to see, you know, a development of maybe a clover compatibility sub-index within the PPI. That's probably where I see part of the development of PPI going forward.
Yes, very good. Good question from TJ. I suppose, how many varieties should be put in one mix? And I think maybe you touched on 4, but if you're putting a mix together yourself, what is it? Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 4? What are you thinking?
It could be 1. So really, it could be 1 if it's hitting high quality, high grade utilization. There's 1 variety, and you know it's not deficient in too many of the yield traits. That's a perfect. God, really, if I was getting up, I'd probably go with 2 varieties in a clover. That's really where I see, because we did trials here where we mixed 3 varieties together, 4 varieties together. We had monocultures and binary mixtures and that. So when you do mix varieties, it's basically the average. You can look at the PPI, you pick 2 varieties, you take the average, that's what the sward is going to do. And that's great. And, you know, you can mix good with bad. If you have a good quality and good digestibility, you may be low on yield, you mix in a high yielder and you get generally good enough performance. But also you are going to dilute the advantages of maybe the high quality, you know. So the more you mix, the more dilution is going on, and therefore, you know, you probably won't get the advantage of that. So look, 2 or 3 varieties. That's the one thing
where you kind of said you need probably a certain amount of each in each mix to see those traits, Tomas.
Exactly.
That's the one thing, I suppose, when you see these bags, just to make sure that often you can see 4, 5, 6 different varieties, and some of them in small enough quantities, Tomas, you probably question, are you going to get any benefit from that variety in a mix then, are you?
That's exactly it. So look, I suppose new varieties are always flashy. You know, it's sales, new varieties are flashy. But when new varieties come onto the PPI or come into the market, they're probably there in low enough numbers anyway. They haven't gone through the same multiplication processes, you know, the seed building processes. So they are going to be there in low enough numbers, and that's to be expected for the first couple of years of varieties. So you can tolerate that. But yeah, sometimes the best varieties be included at small rates. It really is a fool's game. It is. You really do need to be looking. So you go down to your co-op, you ask for a bag of grass seed. You might be given a choice. You mightn't be. Like, it's just, while you probably are going to leave the co-op with that bag of grass seed, you probably don't have much other choice, essentially, unless you're very well organized. It is worthwhile to look down through the varieties, make sure they're all on the PPI to begin with, then maybe look at if it's down as a grazing mix and you see that there's a 1-star grazing variety in that mix. It's always worth asking the question to the person in the co-op, why is that variety there? Because look, you might end up going home with it and reseeding or sowing it in, but the next year the co-op is going to have to talk to the seed companies and you know, make up a mix essentially for that company, and they can always ask, oh, we got questions last year, why was that variety included in? And it keeps everyone honest essentially. And you know, the ability of using the PPI to select your mix is probably not there as such, because varieties tend to stay within house, but just keeping everyone honest and asking questions about why a mix was kind of designed that way is worthwhile, you know.
And I've seen lots of cases now where groups have come together, let it be purchasing groups, discussion groups early in the year, and they've ultimately looked at the PPI got a bit of advice, put together the roll mixes, and they're there and in play for the year.
Exactly.
A couple of other questions. There's one there. Any update on the star rating for? It's obviously for utilization on Nashota. So
Nashota. So in front of me here, I have the 2022 recommend PPI. The 2023 one was produced this year, but it wasn't really. It's kind of hard to find. It's kind of hidden. But Nashota is a 5-star grazing variety, and also what is not there, Barrowave came back as a 5-star grazing variety, and you also had Glenfield was a 5-star grazing variety. So a lot of the varieties up to the upper part of the PPI that didn't have a grazing utilization, say last year, they're all tetraploid varieties, and they all came back as 5-star grazing varieties.
Very good. I have two last questions. In terms of, there's obviously a recommended white clover list. Are we going to get to a point in time to come where we're going to have a breakdown within that? No different than our grass varieties, I suppose, Tomas, in terms of clover is obviously going to be very, very important in our grazing systems going forward.
Yeah, so a clover profit index is essentially it. So yeah,
really?
I sowed last year, I sowed 18 different clover varieties, and we've in different nitrogen rates and stuff like that. We have a PhD student going to start in that study probably this September. So we have a year's data from this year, we'll have another year's data next year, and then that student will probably start, looking through the data and seeing what differences is. So currently we have a recommended list for white clover varieties. It has basically it's just yield and clover proportion essentially is all that's in it. Where we want to move the clover recommended list testing towards is looking at the qualities of these clovers. Because quality has a massive effect on milk production, and if there are differences between the varieties, that'll be good to know. And also nitrogen fixation. So within that trial I sowed last year, we have varieties that are getting no nitrogen throughout the year, and varieties that are getting 75 kilograms of nitrogen, 150 kilograms of nitrogen, and say also within that we have the grass only getting 0 nitrogen. So if we have a grass only sward that's yielding 10 ton getting 0 nitrogen, and we have a grass clover sward that's yielding 12 ton getting 0 nitrogen, there's obviously 2 ton of fixation going on there, and then there'll also be differences between the different clover varieties. So they're kind of the traits. We'll have yield traits, quality traits, persistency of the clovers, and also nitrogen fixation of clovers is where we kind of see this clover profit index going. But we're probably looking at, by the time it's introduced commercially, you're probably looking at 2026 or 2027. Maybe a prototype by 2025.
You got ahead of me there. I was going to kind of put a bit of pressure on you when that was coming.
Yeah.
But obviously the work has to be done. But it's in the pipeline, and it's something that's available. The last one is, and I was standing in a field of it yesterday in terms of Ballyhaise, red clover. There isn't, I'm right in saying, Irish recommended list for red clover. I suppose, why is that, and when are we likely to have one? And what can people do in the meantime, I suppose, Tomas?
Yeah, so you're right. There is no Irish recommended list for red clover. And the reason for that is it wasn't an important crop here in Ireland. And therefore, resources being inputted into doing trial work on that, it wasn't done. But there is talks from our department, recommended list testing, to introduce a red clover protocol. So in future years that may happen. Currently in Teagasc Moorepark last year I sowed I think we had 8 red clover varieties, and we have the grass only monocultures there as well. Some of you might have seen it at the open day. Really good looking crop actually. So we've done first cut off that, we've done second cut off that. Differences between varieties off the top of my head, it might have been 500 kilograms of dry matter difference in yield between those. And going forward, we're also going to be looking at we might look at silage quality. We need to kind of come up with a methodology to look at the silage quality coming from these red clover varieties, which would be really, really interesting work. So we're thinking maybe if we could, bag each sample at harvesting, vacuum pack it, remove the air, test the silage 6 weeks later, we might be able to do something in that sphere. And we're also going to be looking at nitrogen fixation as well. So that's Generally,
Very
we'll
good.
have, so I suppose we're maybe a step ahead of the department. We're looking at these varieties under different nitrogen rates, and maybe the hope would be that the department might adopt some of the methodologies that we're developing in the trial here in Moorepark, and that could become our red clover. So currently, there's no list. If you were looking to get more information on red clover varieties, your best port to call is to go to the UK recommended list. They have a list of about 12 varieties, I'd say, and that would steer you in the right direction.
Very good, Tomas. We're done maybe a little bit longer, but all good stuff. And I think great questions from our listeners this morning. It's obviously a space that it gets lots of attention. I suppose the key points there being, Tomas, as you say, if you act early in the year, you probably have the opportunity to go and make the best list, make the best seed possible in terms of what you want to put in your bag. If not, I suppose then you're going purchasing, as you say, ultimately look at the list, make sure they're on the recommended list, and make sure they're doing what you want them to do. As you said, is it a grazing type mixture that you want, or is it a silage type mixture that you want?
Yeah, exactly, Jane, because like I said, look, it's a 10-year investment. You sow it year zero, but you're going to be looking at it for another 10, 12 years. So you don't want to put something in that's wrong, because you'll just be regretting it, for a long time. So it does pay just to take a half hour, make sure the mix is right for you, and it should give you a good return thereafter.
Yeah, and lots of work, as you say, ongoing in terms of clover, a clover index, and also, as you say, in terms of the idea of actually having a red clover recommended list. So lots of work undergoing in that whole variety space. So look, we appreciate your time, Tomas, as always, very informative. If there is any more questions, folks, and you do think of anything at a later date, don't be afraid to drop me an email. Otherwise, thanks a million, Tomas, and we'll see you listeners next week. As always, farm safely. It's a busy time on farms in terms of trying to get silage and stuff done, so just take care. Thanks, folks.
That's all for this week's bonus episode from the Let's Talk Dairy webinar series, and don't forget to look out for more bonus episodes each week. I'll be back with the usual Dairy Age podcast on Monday, so do listen in then. I'm Stuart Childs, and thanks for listening.